9.2 billion tons of plastic. And of that, 7 billion tons is no longer in use. Out of that 7 billion tons, bear with me, around 9% has been recycled, 12% has been incinerated, and where has the rest gone? Around 5.5 billion tons. It's gone into the ocean, it's gone into landfills, and it has gone into our precious fresh water. So only 3% of the world's water is actually fresh water. And of this, 2/3 is held up in frozen glaciers or else otherwise unavailable for our usage, okay? So basically it's sparse and it's precious and we need to look after it. Now, 1.1 billion people in the world do not have access to fresh water. We, I think, perhaps take this for granted here, but it is a huge issue. And many of these ecosystems overseas do not look like this, okay? Pollution has made them impossible to be utilized for drinking water and purposes that are just necessary for human living. So despite this, there is a huge bias towards looking at plastics in the marine environment. So perhaps there's a bit more charisma or a bit more interest associated with the marine environment, but it's actually the fresh water that we depend on for drinking water. So that should be an area of future interest and should be where a lot more scientists look to with the issue of plastics. And it's a big problem because we don't have the data, or we historically haven't had the data to know what's going on in our fresh water to actually be able to do anything about it. So now in some places it's got to this sort of state, which is not good for anyone. So since the dawn of human evolution, rivers have been a really, I guess, a big use, they've been used a lot to carry away waste. So out of sight, out of mind. Before we realized just how much it's going to affect these environments, it was drop it down the river and it's gone. So 80% of plastic waste is actually distributed by more than 1,000 rivers. And a lot of these aren't just the massive rivers that you think of, like the Amazon and such. Actually, a lot of them are smaller rivers that pass through really intensive human settlements. And of the 50 most polluted rivers in the world, 44 are in Asia. So let's have a look at 2 of those. You've got the Mekong here to your left. This is the second most biodiverse river in the world. It provides food, energy, water, security for around 70 million people, okay? The annual fishery value is 11 billion, and it transports 40,000 tons of plastic into the South China Sea per year. Another case study, the mighty Ganga. So the Ganges River supports 655 million people, and it supports, quite importantly, the Ganges River dolphin. So it is, by every means, the beating heart of India. I've been fortunate to swim in it a few times, and it has a awe or a feeling like no other. It's the second most significant contributor of plastics to the ocean after the Yangtze River in China, which contributes around 172,000 tons. So fishing and textiles by what I mean clothing, fibers and such, are some of the most significant contributors, and it increases as you follow the Ganges River from up in the foothills of the Himalayas down to the sea. Logically, the concentration of plastics increase as you make it down. So in the freshwater environment, plastics can be influenced by multiple factors. And some of these we actually don't know much about, and that's what we're hoping to find out. So obviously the human use of the catchment is a big one, where our stormwater drains go out, what we're actually doing on this water body. Riparian planting and vegetation Logically, that could be a solution to help stop some of the plastics from entering our waterways. Hydrological conditions, rainwater events and storms are a big one. Interestingly, with the increasing frequency and intensity of storm events, it'll be very interesting to see how that will impact the amount of plastic entering our precious freshwater. River morphology also influences the way that plastic may be distributed, as well as lakes and large water bodies. So we're hoping to find out whether or not lakes are a dilution point for plastics or an accumulation point, or how they respond in this huge, huge body of water. So the research that's been done so far in Aotearoa's freshwater in regards to plastics pollution is fairly sparse. A recent study looked at 3 lakes in the North Island and found concentrations comparable with Europe and the USA, which is pretty mind-boggling. But they just looked at 1 site per lake, so it'd be very interesting to have a really good full spatial study of a New Zealand lake. Urban stream water was looked at in multiple places: Auckland, Waikato, Wellington, Christchurch, by Mr. Teddy, and he also looked at ingestion in invertebrates, and they found between 1 and 44 plastics per cubic metre, depending on the site, and invertebrate taxa having ingested plastics at 63% of the sites studied. So this rings a few alarm bells for me, because obviously our invertebrates are a really, really key source of food and protein for our freshwater fish. So we've got 70% of our native fish are either threatened with extinction or at risk of extinction, and this is really very serious. So we want to know what's happening with our fish, what's happening with our invertebrates, to ensure that plastic pollution is not just another stress that they have to deal with. In Auckland, some of the, I think it was the Foul Creek there, was found with up to 303 particles per cubic metre. A lot of those were films, these polymers that are found in paints and coating materials, as well as fragments, and lots of plastics found in construction materials. So very interesting. So how much is actually getting into the ocean, and where is it coming from? It's estimated that between 8 and 14 million tonnes of plastic enters the ocean annually, and everyone on this planet has a responsibility to deal with this issue, from consumers to big industrial to governments, organisations. We've all got a part to play. And plastic can enter the marine environment from both terrestrial and marine sources. And I think it's often not so commonly known that actually a large proportion, 20% of plastic, enters the ocean from the ocean. So land, it can enter from littering, it can enter from mismanaged waste, natural disasters, as we saw on the West Coast there, improper management, all sorts. And then the remaining 20% enter from the ocean. So these can include industrial shipping, commercial fishing and aquaculture. This is thought to be half of that, so 10%. And this is an issue that is just becoming more and more important. So nets getting lost, we saw a lot of evidence of that in the South Pacific. On reefs, these nets just getting stuck on the coral everywhere. It's such a sad sight. Ghost nets, they call them, but also aquaculture as well. In aquaculture, we use a lot of ropes and things to hold everything together. Those are made of plastic fibres. Those can shed into the environment and be consumed by organisms. Or else, another place it could go is into one of the world's 5 largest ocean gyres. So, formed by the rotation of Earth, the shape of dry land, and surface winds, these ocean gyres provide a circulating abyss for plastic. So they assist in driving what is known as the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt. And this is extremely important as it provides a route for circulating nutrients around the world. It regulates temperature. It does a huge amount of important things for us, and it also contains a lot of plastic. So there was a study that found about 32.7 particles per meter cubed in the surface waters of the North Pacific Gyre there. And the North Pacific Gyre has been made the most famous of the five, as it's also known as the Great Ocean Garbage Patch. You may have heard of it. It's an area of about 1.6 million kilometers, the size of Texas, that sits between California and Hawaii. And you may see the odd straw, you may see a lid of a cup, but it's actually what you may not see that is possibly will pose the most threat. So while some natural materials such as wood, glass, and metal can break back down to the organic components that fuel life on Earth, plastic cannot. So defined by Dr. Google as extremely small, tiny pieces of plastic, and defined by scientists as particles under 5 millimeter in size, microplastics mimic the shape and size and sometimes color of plankton and algae. So these are the foundations of the entire ocean food web, and also the foundations of the seafood-loving Homo sapien. So we know that now plastics are a big issue, and physical abrasion, UV light, wave action, and living organisms can break particles that are larger than 5 millimeters down into those smaller sizes to produce microplastics. So the concern for these particles has risen in recent years. They can be found in all sorts of different sizes and shapes. You might get transparent fibers from fishing nets, or you might get colored from human clothing. And they can kind of be categorized into two types, primary and secondary. So primary particles will enter the ocean at that tiny size. So they're produced at the tiny size and they enter at the tiny size. Examples of these are cosmetic microbeads, fibers, nurdles, etc. And actually a study showed that back in the days of the microbead face washes, that one use of that microbead face wash could actually let out between 10 and 100,000 particles down into our industrial sewage system. So even though those are perhaps not so popular now, because we know how much of an issue they are, the consequences of those decisions are still rolling around in the environment today. So you've also got the secondary plastics, and those are the larger ones that are broken down via UV, etc. So what happens once they enter our wastewater system? Now, wastewater systems aren't quite designed to remove particles that are half the size of a human blood cell. They're designed to take all of the nasty stuff out of our waste, not quite particles that small. So fibers and different things that come out of our washing machine effluent obviously make their way to the wastewater treatment plants, and some of them may be taken out. That may end up as sewage sludge overseas that's utilised in agricultural fertiliser, so it makes its way back into the land, which the rain could potentially then wash any plastics there back into the aquatic environment, or it is discharged. So in New Zealand we have wastewater effluent that is discharged into paddocks. The one in Wānaka here is into a paddock near the airport. We have a lot that are discharged directly into the ocean, and also ones that are discharged into freshwater environments as well. Now, just to give you an idea of how many plastics these can actually let out, in Glasgow on the River Clyde, there is a wastewater treatment plant that works at 98% efficiency and still releases up to 65 million microplastics into the environment daily. So bit of an issue. The situation in Aotearoa was looked at by Helena Ruffle from Canterbury, and she sampled particles between 300 microns and 1 millimeters. 300 microns is actually quite big in the grand scheme of microplastics, if you think of a third of a millimeter. And she found around 1.3 particles per litre in effluent. So we know that 1.3 particles per litre is going into the environment from that wastewater treatment plant. Interestingly, 58% of those particles were fragments. I would have expected them to potentially be fibres, and the dominant polymers were polyester, polyethylene, and polypropylene. So when these plastics get into the environment, it's actually going to affect different animals in a different way, depending on their feeding, the chemical makeup of the plastic. So although plastic's density may affect where it sits in the water column initially, that density can actually change quite quickly. So you have living organisms, bacteria, that will very quickly form a biofilm on that plastic and actually change the density to bring it down to a deeper level in the environment. So also if the plastic is consumed by an organism and then excreted as feces, it's more likely to get deeper. Or if an animal like a whale has ingested a whole lot of plastic and then it dies, it brings the plastic down to the deep and marine snow. So in terms of distribution, around 15% ends up on the beaches, okay? 15% is around the ocean's surface, and 70% is down around the seafloor. So multiple studies have found that benthopelagic or demersal benthic species, basically species that like to feed down around the bottom, often have higher concentrations of plastic in their guts. As it turns out, it's not that great. So we know that plastic disturbs microbial processes, it's physically destructive in food chains, and it's active chemically. Drifting plastic touching coral will increase the likelihood of disease from 4% to 89%. So because it is such a vector for pathogens, it has the ability to really muck with the coral. And these coral are already dealing with climate change, bleaching events, and we're hitting them with another stressor. So it's just not that good. Marine animals everywhere have now been found with plastic in their guts. I think there was 29 kilos of plastic pulled out of a dead sperm whale at one stage. 9 out of 10 seabirds ingested plastic, they think, and by 2050, it's estimated that 99% of seabirds will have ingested it. And 1/3 of every turtle that washes up in New Zealand actually has ingested plastic. It's not actually super commonly known, but we have 5 species of turtles that frequent our waters. Now, back in 2004, there was a ban on a chemical called polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, that was incorporated in plastic. And they actually found in the UK that orcas with high levels of these PCBs were experiencing reproductive issues. So plastics can act as both a source and a sink for toxic chemicals. So there are additives that are put into plastics to provide flame retardants, to provide malleability, dyes, all sorts. And these additives are often the ones with the gnarly chemicals. Or plastic can absorb persistent organics pollutants that are already found in the environment, like heavy metals and things. What worries you about plastic? I'm a little bit interested to see what worries people about it, because there are so many concerns, but here in Wānaka, what worries you? Any things specifically? Yes?
It's just really hard to cut it all out. It's absolutely everywhere.
Yeah.
So making decisions day to day.
Yeah, so true. It can feel quite overwhelming, I think, especially when you walk into the supermarket and it just overwhelms you. So that's a really good one. And I think a lot of us, we really care about the environment and how it's affecting organisms and things. But some people just care about how it's affecting them. So let's go into that. Is it terrible if we chomp a particle here and there? The scary thing is there's very little research into the effects of plastics on humans. It's kind of slowly dribbling out, looking at like post-mortem bodies, whether or not plastics are present. But as I mentioned before, there's the two really key chemical pathways. First, that plastic contains additives that are knowingly carcinogenic, some of them that are knowingly disruptive to our hormones, that knowingly cause neurobehavioral changes. And then secondly, they are a sponge to persistent organic pollutants, industrial chemicals, things that are leached out into the ocean and then cling on to plastic. And it's really these two that we're most concerned about. Plastic itself, relatively benign. It's these additives and these dyes that are put into it that make it a lot more harmful. So we know that these chemicals can cause reproductive issues, immunological issues, neurobehavioral. They can change our hormones. And I was hearing from a friend the other day about some mates of his over in the US that have stopped eating fish because of their potential vectors to transmit microplastics into the human body. Interestingly, some recent research found that if plastics enter the brain, it reduces the production of GFAP protein. Don't ask me what that stands for. And this has been associated with the development of Alzheimer's, as well as depression and other behavioral neurodegenerative diseases as well. And nanoplastics, I'm not going to go into them too much, but they are a whole nother kettle of fish. They are like the 1 micron and below sort of size. And there was a study that exposed mice, pregnant mice, to nanoplastics, and the babies were found with the nanoplastics in almost every organ of the body. So yes, that's a little bit depressing, but it's just reality at this stage. So how is it getting into our diet? One route is through the food that we eat. We know that we can inhale it into our lungs as well, like it's literally floating around in the air. But food is another route. So in the UK, they found 70 pieces per 100 grams of mussel. That's quite an extreme quantity. In New Zealand, 1.5 microplastics per mussel was found. And that makes me really sad because I am very, very passionate about mussels because they are just the best seafood that you can buy in terms of sustainability. They stabilize sediment, pull out nitrogen and phosphorus, and literally clean our ocean for us. So don't let this put you off buying mussels, please. But oysters are obviously another route for particles to enter our diet, and that takes me to a next level of sadness due to their immense deliciousness. But they are another filter feeder, so they do fairly indiscriminately filter particles out, and some of those will be plastics. What about fish? So different studies have found different quantities, like number per fish in the gut, but this is incidence. So these numbers, 95, 80 to 100, 80%, is one or more particle per fish. So 95% of fish sampled in the Great Barrier Reef were found with plastics, 80 to 100% China, 80% Rapa Nui, 65.5% Fiji, and a body. Now, humans have an inherent ability to care about only what directly affects them. So as emotive and heart-wrenching it was to see video footage of a turtle with a straw very strongly stuck in its nose, showing that the plastics can actually get into our fish and chips or our diet often can cause policy change to happen a little quicker. So that kind of led me to some of my research. Previously, I looked into wild hoki. So hoki were once upon a time our most commercially valuable fish species by export. They still are. They also were commonly used in the McDonald's fish fillet. I'm not sure if they still are, but basically they're worth a whole lot of money. And hoki are quite hideous looking fish. They hang out between 200 and 800 meters deep. They kind of look like slimy silver rats. Like, they're cool, but they're ugly. And I was really interested to know whether or not they were ingesting microplastics. So I looked at incidence in the West Coast, Cook Strait and Chatham Rise populations. And then I also did a separate experiment to look at snapper. And this was 3 months feeding plastics to snapper, which sounds really, really mean, and it was a bit mean. But it was all in the name of science to figure out kind of what the impact of plastics is on the fish. So I wanted to know, is plastic retained in the snapper gut, and how does it affect it? Does ingestion affect growth and condition, and can it translocate into the flesh that we eat? So I went swimming in fish guts, and which was so great until the end of each day, when I had to take the bus or train back to my wee flat in Kingsland and just stink the place out. So it's good to have those stories. So I sampled 20 fish from each of those locations and basically dissected their gastrointestinal tract, put them in some chemicals, put them through a series of chemical and mechanical steps until we had a dry sample on a glass filter paper of mostly inorganic material to inspect under the microscope. Didn't really expect to see much at all, but we found one or more plastic in 57 out of 60 samples. So that was pretty crazy. Most of it was in the Cook Strait, on average 6.9 particles per fish, which was interesting. So the ingestion rates were higher than some sampling that was done in the Spanish Atlantic and Brazilian estuaries in Turkey, but it was similar to the Great Barrier Reef, China, Rapa Nui, Fiji. Quite sobering, really. Now, these fabulous looking size, black, white, and blue were the key colours, and 90.1% were microfibers, okay? So hold on to that and keep it at the back of your mind. Looked at biometrics, so the growth, etc., retention, translocation, gut histology, and a little. But what I did have was 164 juvenile snapper, which is a pretty amazing resource in the great world of science. So I had 20 of these tanks here, and these were my little mates. And what did we find? We found that growth was significantly compromised in the first half of the trial. Overall, average weight was reduced, surprise, surprise, with a higher quantity of plastic. Interestingly, snapper are quite fussy, and they can actually spit out some plastic as well, which was quite interesting. They're also a bit psycho and would kind of try and eat each other, and one time I came in and one had no eyeball, which was a bit strange. But other studies have also found reduced growth and condition. Condition is essentially a measurement of how chunky and funky a fish is at a certain length. We also looked at retention. So this is really important. I starved the fish for 4 days following the end of the trial. And basically what this did is it gave them the chance to excrete the plastic out of their gastrointestinal tract. And after those 4 days, the fish went to permanent sleep, very sad. And we looked to see the quantity of microplastics that were still in the gastrointestinal tract through a chemical digestion process. And why this is important is that the time that the plastic actually spends in the body is what determines the severity of a negative impact, because the longer it has in the organism, the more chance it has to leach out chemicals, the more chance it has to translocate to other areas of the body through the blood circulatory system. And basically, the more chance it has to cause havoc. So, and what was interesting is, I don't really go into it much here, but the behavior of the fish, I noticed that the fish that had the higher quantities of plastics being fed to them also exhibited like more aggressive behavior when feeding, like they were feeding with more aggression. And I did a novel object test with them, putting Rubik's cubes down into one side of the tank and having a GoPro all set up to capture how long it took for the fish to actually come up close to the Rubik's cube and inspect it. And what we call that in the science world is latency to novel object. And what it translates to in the big wide world is that if it enters, or if it goes closer to the Rubik's cube quickly, then it's bolder, or it's more likely to be less scared of, I've explained this terribly, basically it's more likely to be predated upon because it's less scared of this new novel thing. So that was quite interesting. So the ultimate fate of microplastics really depend on their chemical composition, on their surface chemistry, their shape, size, morphology, etc. And that kind of leads me on to the translocation into the muscular tissue. So we found evidence of translocation at around 1 particle per fish. So this was looking at both fish fillets. And existing studies have found varying results. So my particles were between 50 microns and 2 millimeters. Other studies have found that smaller particles are easier to translocate to that muscular tissue. And they can basically do that based around to act as a vector to take the plastic across the epithelial wall of the intestinal tract into the bloodstream. And that's the most likely particle for really, really tiny plastics. Snapper do have eosinophils, but we don't think it's likely because the particles were a bit big. Persorption, they basically bury through the villi tip, and this is most likely the route that the plastics in this experiment got its way across. We also saw hyperenemia of the liver in 70% of the high treatment samples. So this was a bit of a shock surprise. This black liver is essentially due to blood just hauling its way to the liver, and it's a sign of induced stress, poor feeding, and low levels of fatty acids. So basically it's a pissed off liver. The other thing that I looked at was histopathology, and I really think that the picture does the talking here. So you've got A on the left there. Now that is a cross-section of an intestinal tract, okay? You can see it's lovely and symmetrical. It's a hot-looking intestinal tract. It's got beautifully formed villi, just really nice. Now, B, C, D, E is just degradation on degradation as the snapper were being fed more and more plastics. So histopathology is looking at these really tiny tissues under the microscope and figuring out what is wrong with them. So 60% of the high treatment fish in my experiment exhibited severe changes to structure. And what this means, what this translates to, is long-term compromise of the permeability. So these distal sections, the lower sections of the intestine, they're really critical for the absorption of nutrients, the immunological response to being crook, and basically we can see that plastics impact these intestinal cells pretty badly. So these images here are just showing some more of the changes, and these words are saying them in fancy terms. So you've got increasing goblet cells, thickening of the muscles, blah, blah, blah. Basically, it's just saying that, ouch, my tummy hurts. So that was great and interesting. But now I'm on to my next challenge, and I was so fortunate to be approached, I think it was the end of last year, by Josie from Wānaka, and she was interested in looking the organisation was interested in looking at plastics in our freshwater. And, well, I don't think any of us could have possibly realised how much this would skyrocket into, like, the biggest research project ever. But it's just been so fabulous. And so managed to receive funding from Curious Minds, Planet Play, 10 Square, Games, Otago Science into Action to do this project called A Teeny Tiny Truth. And initially I was just going to do it as a little contracting project and look at a couple of sites and things. And then I was already looking at doing a PhD, and my supervisor said, for goodness sake, just include it in your PhD. And so I thought, oh, well, here we go. Let's do it. And what was really cool is that it really hit home for me and what I'd been doing for the past couple of years, because I spent the last few years up in Kaitaia teaching aquaculture to the Mura Whenua up there, and we spoke a lot in class about all sorts of different things, but plastic came up a lot, and so did the fragmentation in the way that the terrestrial, freshwater and marine environments are managed. So in policy, they're treated very differently as opposed to being treated as they actually are, which is one succinct living being. And we kind of thought that was very frustrating, because the way that the students looked at these environments was very much holistically. And I was kind of quite fascinated by that. And so when Josie approached about this, and Andrew said to include it, I found a way to make it all fit together and to be able to really try and make my students from up north proud and tie it all together. So the result has been Ki Uta Katai, which means mountains to sea, microplastics in southern Aotearoa. So this research is a collaboration between Wānaka, University of Otago Marine Science Departments, and the University of Auckland. So I'm doing my PhD under Auckland, but I have a co-supervisor at Otago. And it's just been the coolest thing ever. So massive thanks to everyone involved, all the team at Y, and my supervisors, Bridie Allen and Andrew Jeffs. Just so cool. So I'll go and trialed 4 methods, including the manta trawl on the left there, 2 sieve-based methods, so that amazing Emma is holding one there, and then we've got one there, and then looking at pure water samples. So I can't do this forever, but the community can. And so citizen science is such an amazing and powerful way to produce extremely valuable data. So we are hoping to continue with this method beyond the end of my PhD and enable the establishment of a long-term repository of data. And what this does is it gives us the ability to track progress and look at the effects of mitigation strategies. So we'll provide a methodology that's publicly available so that actually people can carry on with it and replicate it elsewhere, which is so super cool. Get communities involved. Again, you just don't need to be a scientist to do science. I feel like it's historically been such a kind of, what's the way to say it? This is a bit of the lab procedure. Involves wet peroxide oxidation, which basically dissolves all the little organic particles, and puts these dissolved contents through a vacuum filtration system that you can see up there, and the contents come out on a glass filter paper to look at under the microscope. Now there's a few more layers to that, but we'll keep it nice, short and simple. What's really niggly about plastics research is that the contamination prevention protocol is just crazy. As I mentioned, there's particles literally around in the air that can settle on your samples and provide you to give wrong results. And so we want to do everything ever possible to stop that. So we work under a positive laminar flow hood that pushes air out. We put our filter papers into a muffle oven at 550 degrees to incinerate any possible plastics that could have settled upon them in production, and about a whole lot of other things. So if you absolutely love to faff, then microplastic science is the science for you. Also, just a shout out to Vic here. Only you could make the harshest, most aggressive, white, fluorescent, angry environment look somewhat peaceful. So yeah, great photography there. So that's part one. Part two is assessing the spatial and temporal distribution of microplastics in surface waters of Lake Wānaka, and assessing incidence in wastewater, our wastewater over by the airport, and in fish, so in our trout populations here. So you can see on this map, I'll shuffle this way, these are the sites that we're looking at. So the purple sites are inflows, the green sites are remote sites, the red sites are urban sites, and big yellow is our outflow, so the outlet that feeds into the mighty Clutha. So I'm really interested to look at seasonal variation, whether or not snowmelt impacts the amount of microplastics found in these locations. We want to obviously see any spatial differences between the sites, and we want to identify what these plastics are to actually figure out where they're coming from. So that means looking at the morphology, the color, the size, etc., and then taking it one step further and using the spectroscopy known as Raman spectroscopy through a collaboration with some legends at the University of Otago chemistry department to actually identify the polymers, which helps us take it one step further for figuring out where these particles have come from. If you happen to be a fishing person in this room here, then if you do catch any trout, then feel free to donate me the guts. That would be very, very helpful. And counting, measuring, spending a lot of time looking in the little eyeballs of the microscope. So this is Glendhu Bay, and I don't think you need to be a scientist to realize that these are, there are some plastics in here. As you can see, fibers seem to be a common morphotype. This one was really quite surprising, so it'd be interesting to try and figure out where those are coming from. That there are some funky looking particles that are really so super tiny, plastics or all sorts. So it could be a polyethylene, polypropylene, whatever. Anyway, what's important is it's got this very distinct blue color, and it seems to break up into smaller sizes as well, but we're finding it a lot. So if you have any ideas where it could possibly have come from, please let me know, because I will add it to my list on my notes on my phone of possible routes of where it could have come from. So any guesses? We've had like bailage. Strapping tape construction? Yeah, because that's used so surely we can come up with some stuff. Now, that's a part of the PhD. And then these are the parts that will be coming up in the next year or two. So the next part is extremely close to my heart because it may involve a ski expedition or three. So I want to investigate microplastics presence in snow in commercial ski fields versus remote mountain ranges. So I want to investigate it in both an established snowpack, so when it hasn't snowed for about 2 weeks, so it's had lots of wind and stuff and people all around it. And then I also want to investigate it with freshly fallen snow. So you take the top 2 centimetres or so of a 10 centimetre snow dump and analyse that. So that should be really, really interesting. And basically what I want to know is, does human activity influence the incidence of plastics in snow? How much comes from the atmosphere? So how much goes up and then comes down in precipitation that falls as snow? How much plastic is in our snow and how much is entering adjacent waterways that are then getting into our lakes? Where is it coming from and how do we stop it? So the whole point of this isn't again to blame people skiing. It's to actually work together as a community and come up with some solutions. So it's been really cool. Local ski fields have actually been super keen and on board to allow this project to happen. And yeah, I can't wait. And so hopefully the remote mountain range part of this will involve a few ski touring trips. So watch the space. And why do we care? Well, the main reason why we care is that plastic actually makes snow melt faster. And after the season we've had, we just simply can't afford any more melting. So more plastics in the snow actually mean more solar radiation is absorbed. Obviously, plastics produce fossil fuels in the breakdown as well, and climate change means less snow. They for plastics in the snow other than atmospheric fallout. We have all of this amazing techie gear, Gore-Tex and whatever, that does a really good job at keeping us dry and warm, but also it is made of plastic and has all sorts of additives in it as well to keep us dry. So, Verona and Triple Cone, and possibly Mount Alta, and maybe somewhere down towards up the Matuki, not sure, to be confirmed the sites, but should be kind of cool and exciting. Now, the next thing I'm going to look at is a bit more aligned with my previous research, which is on the marine environment, and that is to assess microplastic input at the mouth of Te Mata-o or the Clutha River, in the water and in Kaimoana species. So this is in the very early stages of development. I'm not sure which species I'll look at yet, still deciding, but the whole point is to try and develop almost like a source to sea budget, like a plastics budget. So we know what's coming in at the top, at the lake, in the mountains, and then we can see what's coming out at the outflow into the ocean. So I think that'll give us a lot of information on what's being picked up along the way, because sampling the entire Clutha River is a whole PhD in itself, so leave that to someone else. But we really care about the Kaimoana species and ensuring that these are being managed sustainably and that any impacts of plastic are mitigated. So I think it would be really interesting to look at Kaimoana species. Another thing that I'm hoping to look at in the mouth of Te Mata-o is climate impacts, so looking at storm events versus when the weather's been settled for a long time. As we know, climate's going to cause increased frequency and intensity of these storm events, so it would be really good to know how much is coming out in these events versus settled weather. Precious titi, our mutton birds. So they are obviously a taonga species and really, really important to Māoris. So we really want to know that these are doing all right. They already face a lot of threats, and they make huge migrations across the world. So as I mentioned earlier, 9 out of 10 seabirds have ingested plastics, so we do need to know what's going on with these species, and I may be able to help some of the locals to survey the populations as well while we're looking at plastic incidents. So the whole reason behind this is that these places are so special to me. They're so close to my heart, my tūranga waiwai, my significant place to stand. I grew up in Aotearoa, and we spend a lot of time, me and my dad, diving around the Catlins coast and Stewart Island, and it's just such a special place for us. So this research, beyond the informative, I guess, part of it, is that it really provides me an opportunity to contribute what I'm knowledgeable in, or hopefully, to places that are really significant. So 2/3 plastic. These fibres are potentially better able to tangle, catch and accumulate in the gastrointestinal tract. And the vast majority obviously come from washing machines, from us wearing synthetic fabrics, wastewater treatment plants, sewage sludge, ropes, fishing gear, atmospheric fallout, you name it. What was really interesting is they did an experiment with zooplankton and found that fibres take longer to pass through their body, and also individuals exposed to microfibres produced half the usual larvae, and they were smaller. So that kind of rings some alarm bells for me. You can purchase a guppy bag, which is like a small micron bag that's made of, I think, thrown away fishing nets, and you put your plastic clothing in there, and then the fibers will accumulate in the corners, and then you can dispose of those in the bin. So it'll be really interesting once we've got some data on the wastewater effluent in Wānaka, and maybe that will be a really cool driving force behind educating people. Now, there's also the usual culprits, plastic water bottles. There's literally no excuse in New Zealand to use plastic water bottles. I'd be embarrassed if I was carrying one around. Plastic bags, straws. This is a favorite meme of my first year marine science class. Always gets a few giggles. Coffee cups. I think what we don't realize is that even if our coffee cup says it's biodegradable, it's not biodegradable in the washing in the litter bin. It's only biodegradable under certain conditions. So compostable, biodegradable doesn't mean much unless it's actually composted, not just thrown in the bin, because otherwise that's still going to take a really, really long time to break down. But I already do all of these things. Well, kudos to you. Take a moment to feel smug. There's so much work ahead, so many things that you can help to contribute to. Takeaways are a really, really big one. Like, we're all sometimes a bit tired and lazy and get takeaways, and it's fabulous and delicious, but it's not fabulous if you're using a plastic container, unless it's BYO. So if you can bring your own containers, otherwise I see a lot of them in Wānaka now using cardboard and stuff, which is awesome. Buying local produce is really good. Avoiding any vegetables or fruit wrapped in plastic. Going for food in the nude. Processed food is always in packaging, right? So if you want to lose a kilo or two, avoid that processed food, and you and the earth will be a bit healthier. Bulk food, Freshlink, if you can go and get some of your stuff there, then that's wicked. Getting bamboo toothbrushes, hair bars. For me, I think when I hear that a toothbrush is going to be around for like 400 years, that really sinks in the reason why it's worth getting a bamboo toothbrush. So where is the rest of the world at? Well, Canada has banned most single-use plastics and now calls plastics a toxic substance. India, single-use free 2022. Norway, 97% of plastic bottles recycled. And Rwanda, if you use plastic, you go to jail. So don't tell me that the government and management doesn't do anything, because that is just very impressive. So New Zealand is actually really quite crap in the grand scheme of things, unfortunately. We have been named as one of the most wasteful countries in the world. Per capita, we produce 50 to 65 kilos of solid waste per person per month. And you're thinking, oh, that can't be true. Well, it is. Ministry for the Environment say so. Obviously not all of that is plastic, but it just gives you an idea of kind of how wasteful we are as a country. We don't have good data, really any data, on how much is recycled in New Zealand, which is a real bummer. And also, China stopped taking our recycling. They said no, and we still, I don't think, have found a very good way of dealing with it. So hopefully that is in the works, because I know there are some cool people working on it. So look forward to hearing what happens there by doing their little bits. And you don't have to be a professional sustainability guru to help out. We've got a small population here, and so if everyone just does a little bit, it's actually a huge impact. We also have a lot of passionate people and a few people with quite a bit of time on their hands. So if we're pissed off, we can actually get quite a lot done, which the power of the pissed off. We can make measurable changes, and there are so many different ways to contribute. So it makes me a bit excited. Also, what's happening is a global plastics treaty. So 173 countries are involved in this at the moment, and they're developing the first draft as we speak. And basically what this is going to create is a shared global goal on how to deal with the plastic pollution problem. So this is like so exciting. And it's a mechanism to harmonize reporting, monitoring, management, and how it's all dealt with. Also financial mechanism to deliver support and putting investments into science. So I think this is quite cool. I don't know about you. Now this Jane Goodall quote kind of sums it up quite nicely. So only if we understand will we care, only if we care will we help, and only if we help shall they be saved. So in order to understand, you really need to be provided with some information. And in order to be provided with information, that information has to be created. So it's just super cool what Y is doing here to help initiate this research in this little area of the world, as this is quite significant research for our country. So yeah, really so super cool. This also highlights the need for science communication, and you don't need to be a scientist to communicate science, so everyone has a really important role to play to talk to their friends and whānau about these issues, especially the microfibers, and start thinking out some solutions. Like a lot of the best innovation have been made by everyday peeps. So the recurring responses was that I don't want to be murdered by my children. Beyond that, we're actually kaitiaki, we're guardians, and we have a huge responsibility to ensure that the water that's leaving our rohe or territory is not polluted. It is a responsibility, and we should really be taking it with both hands. I think there's quite a bright blue future ahead. Corporate accountability is becoming better. International treaty, again, that is just so cool. Changing mindsets, we're slowly becoming aware of the fast fashion issue and hopefully moving away from it. Consumer demands are changing, and New Zealand has a really cool opportunity to be a leader in both research and policy. We've got a really high value industry around the ocean, freshwater environments that we really need to preserve. So if you don't take anything out of this other than the fact that it's going to cost us heaps of money to restore instead of prevent in the first place, then that's all you take out of it. Food safety can also be a really quick activator to implore policy change. So if we can utilise that, then awesome. And finally, a passionate community can really achieve a lot. So I really implore you to think how you can contribute in any way and just go for it. But just want to finish off by saying a huge thank you to everyone in here and about 1 million other people who have just been like amazing in contributing to this research and previous research and just my whole scientific journey. So ngā mihi kia koe. Huge thank you. Cheers.
Thank you, Veronica. We've got time for some questions. If you are asking a question, it's great if you can identify yourself, if you're willing to, because this is being a recorded session. I can start it off. I've got a couple of questions, actually, okay. Veronica.
Got no idea. I'd say so, perhaps. I mean, it'd more so be the adhering, like plastics adhering to the outside versus actually being growing inside the plant.
Okay, that'll do. The other question is, I think recently we've been told to do things like make sure that when we're painting outside of houses and cleaning our cars, to make sure none of it goes into the streams. Is that sort of pollution being seen in the lake, or is it too early to say?
Is that paint, sorry? Like
paints,
yes, yeah,
and car cleaning chemicals, yeah.
Yeah, no, I've seen evidence of that in the lake. It's a really good question. As I mentioned, there's a huge amount of plastic that enters from our activities on the ocean, and we're kind of only just realising how much fishing is a contribution to that. I wonder if there is plant-based alternatives. I mean, it's funny when it comes to fishing, the last thing anyone wants ever is to lose their fish. And plastic seems to be some of the strongest means to make that not happen. So I think you can get like metal kind of almost like metal rope or like thin metal rope that could possibly work. It's not see-through, so it would potentially be spotted by the fish. I know that there is a bit of research going on up north with utilising natural fibres in the form of harakeke flax, cabbage cheese, all sorts to create ropes to be used in aquaculture. So I do wonder if that could be utilised in fishing. I mean, we didn't used to have plastic fishing nets and fishing twine, and it was natural fibres that were used, so we do know that they did work in the past. So I know that there are some scientists that are utilising mātauranga Māori to look back into the past and actually bring those ideas forward and propel them kind of into the spotlight as a means to get through that and use like a really cool alternative that doesn't have those bad effects and also links to the past.
Any other questions? Won't record.
Hi, thanks for such an amazing talk. I learned a lot. I was just wondering about, there's been a lot of deaths of penguins, both yellow-eyed penguins, big numbers of little blue penguins washing up dead. Are they getting autopsied and looked at carefully to see if there's microplastics in there?
Interestingly, when I was working up in Kaitaia, the 90-mile beach, which isn't quite 90 miles, but not too far off, we used to see a lot of mass deaths of little blue penguins. We counted like 86, I think, one time, took the students out to have a look. And they're malnourished, those ones. So with climate change, you're seeing a changing distribution of prey, and the prey is often going out into the depths, deeper and further away from shore, and so these little tiny little blue penguins are actually having to work a lot harder to find their food. So that is what I'm aware of as one of the major contributions to the little blue deaths. Fishing is also another one, but that's more related to the yellow-eyed and fiordland-crested down south here. They often get caught in set nets and by other means. It's, really quite sad. There was a friend of mine works in inshore fisheries, and she had a fisherman catch a yellow-eyed penguin at one spot and then go back to the same spot the next day and catch another one, which is just like makes your heart break a bit. And there was an observer on board, so it was recorded both times. But the seabirds and plastics seem to be a really big issue. I know they looked at albatross. I'm not sure if they're looking at penguins for plastics, but I'll find out for you.